I'm Conor Nakkan, Senior Researcher at the Intergenerational Foundation. We're a research charity fighting for a fairer deal for younger and future generations in the UK. We work on some of the big policy challenges shaping the lives of young people, from housing and student finance to taxation, the labour market and the environment. Our work focuses on exposing intergenerational unfairness and proposing practical, evidence-based reforms. In this new podcast series, we'll be speaking to some of the UK's leading experts on the issues that matter most to younger and future generations. My guest today is Jim Dickinson, Associate Editor at WonkHE, where he's written for many years extensively on higher education, student finance, maintenance support, and university governance. And so here at IF, student finance is one of the issues that we've probably spent the most time researching and campaigning on. So this is a topic that we care a great deal about. Jim, thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure.
So as I said, you've spent years writing about universities and how higher education policy works in practice. So I thought to start us off, it'd be good to ask you how you first came to the issue and what interests you about it.
When I go home at Christmas, my mum says, have you got a proper job yet? And the answer is always no. So when I was a student, I became a student representative. And then I worked for NUS in various roles and went on to be chief exec of a students' union. And now I work for a higher education policy organisation called WonkHE, as you say, where our job is to obsess about bands and then be that mate of yours that is really obsessed with a particular band and can't understand why you're not quite as obsessed with the band. So I've always been interested in adjacent to the student finance question, and now sort of my job is to really get close to what's going on and why it's going on, and trying to get underneath the skin of the kind of headlines that you will see in the media.
That's great. So I think speaking of student finance, it's probably good at the outset to do somewhat of an explainer because things can get very complicated very quickly. So I suppose, could you give us a bit of a sense of how student loans work now in England and what are the kind of different plans you sometimes hear about in some of the media debate?
Sure. As you say, there are multiple plans, but broadly they all share a set of features. So on the one hand, it's a loan. You borrow some money that is then either spent on you for your maintenance costs or is given in the kind of form of a voucher to the university or higher education provider that you've chosen and that has chosen to admit you. So that is what I would call the principal. This is the amount of money that we sort of loan to people. But there's then a series of features that make it a bit less like a loan. So one of the features is it gets written off after a certain amount of time, and one of the big undergraduate plan over the past 10 years, the Plan 2 loans, were written off after 30 years. Now, new people who borrow this year, that gets written off after 40 years, and that's partly where some of the government subsidy goes, because some of the debt gets written off, and it's partly viewed as a sort of insurance scheme. It's not every graduate. Some graduates are midwives, some graduates are city bankers. Okay. There's then another feature, which is you don't start repaying it until you earn a certain amount, the repayment threshold. And again, that's always been seen as an insurance feature and/or a place where some of the subsidy goes. And again, you can decide where you put that threshold in relation to current graduate earnings or current earnings and so on, and it differs from plan to plan. But again, that's one of the features. And then there's a couple of quite technical features which involve a sort of tapered interest rate, and it happens to be collected by HMRC rather than traditional debt collectors, and so on and so on. But broadly, as a result, it looks and sounds like a loan because there's this thing called the Student Loans Company and a loan agreement, and it has features that resemble a loan. But it also looks a lot like a tax on graduates. It looks like a graduate tax. It's collected through the tax system. It has these special progressive insurance features. And one of my infuriations actually over the years is when people perhaps on X or on Blue Sky say, well, it's a loan, I'll say, yeah, but it's also partly a tax. And then when people say, oh, it's a tax, I say, Yes, but fundamentally it's a loan, right? You don't have to borrow it. Richest people don't borrow it, and so on and so on. So the kind of mental models that people use to assess fairness, either of tax or of loan, get all messed up when you have this strange hybrid that we have. And that gets worse then when you have multiple plans with multiple sets of terms and conditions, either based on when you went to university or whether you're a postgraduate or an undergraduate, and so on.
Absolutely. I think anyone who encounters this policy space quickly realises just how complex it is. And perhaps there's an even argument that that complexity is almost by design to keep it obscured, but we might come to that. So I think, given all that, most people will have been aware that over the last few months in particular, student finance has been everywhere in the media, which is strange for a number of reasons, because I think for years it was something that was often not in the headlines and treated as a bit more of a technical issue, and as something that governments could, I suppose, tweak in the background without too much public reaction. But that doesn't seem to be true any longer. What's your explanation for why student finance has suddenly shot to be front page news?
It's a really interesting question, and because we're a kind of group of nerds, we actually had a meeting trying to work out why this was a couple of months ago. Look, as you say, for me it's been kind of bubbling under for a long time, a bit like a band that has just not broken through into the top 40, as they used to say. And, there's never not been a moment where you can pop onto X or now Blue Sky or whatever and find people that are showing you how much debt they're in. Particularly medics, I have to say, for all sorts of reasons. But it never really seems to have caught on. But you might remember in the run-up to the budget last year, there was this big debate about whether or not Rachel Reeves did something really big and singular that she could get, kind of public permission for, or whether actually, to make the numbers add up, what she did was a sort of spray of lots and lots of little stealth changes to all sorts of things. And I think it surprised lots of political commentators, actually, that she went for the spray when everyone had been led up the garden path towards the sort of, the big income tax rise. One of the things that she buried in there was this fairly obscure to some people change in the threshold over which you start to repay your student loan. She chose to freeze it for 3 years as of next year. And it's fascinating because when you do a spray like that, when you're a chancellor, not everything will get spotted that day. Not everything is the pasty tax of 2 or 3 years ago. Some things just won't get spotted. And actually, Rishi Sunak had done something really similar in 2022 that pretty much nobody noticed. And so I was kind of sat at home, doom scrolling, thinking this is yet another one of those moments where actually quite a significant change no one will notice. But then a few really interesting things happened. First of all, Martin Lewis, who's always had his bee in his bonnet about this, a former Students' Union officer, of course, Martin Lewis, at one point was on Newsnight, broke the fourth wall and spoke directly down the camera to Rachel Reeves and said, this is a breach of trust. And he'd pulled a similar stunt, actually, in the middle of the last decade. And, the media love that because there's lots of media outlets who literally just write down everything he says. He scratches his nose on This Morning and it's clicks. The second thing that I think was interesting is that there's a group of people who are Plan 2 graduates who are starting to emerge in circles, media circles. And one of the most interesting people, I think, is Ollie Dugmore, who, of course, was Joe, Politics Joe, now at the New Statesman. People are quite interested in him kind of growing up. And he was on the big national demonstration in London over the tripling of tuition fees in 2010. So he puts a podcast out. Lots of people obviously watch this and so on. And then there's a small team of consumer journalists actually on the Sunday Times. And I have a lot of sympathy for consumer journalists because they know they get clicks. But their editors think it's all a bit fluffy because it's kind of like, washing machines that don't work on Watchdog or whatever. And that one of the journalists there clocks that this is an endless human interest story because there's a never-ending supply of, presumably, interns in the office who've got a really big figure in the bottom right-hand corner of their student loan statement that never goes down and only goes up. So you get this kind of confluence of things that happen. Suddenly it booms. I am not sure, if I was giving advice to the Intergenerational Foundation, I'm not sure whether you can cause the stars to collide in quite this way again. But that kind of confluence of factors of young people starting to enter the professional class, the number never going down, Martin Lewis appears, just a really interesting, the stars align, and then suddenly away you go, and we are now where we are.
Yeah, it has been remarkable. I suppose one interesting thing about the debate as it's kind of unfolded over the last few months is that people seem unhappy with the system, but sometimes for different reasons. So some people seem to particularly focus on high interest rates, particularly on Plan 2, and this problem that you can be making consistent repayments, but because the interest rate is so high, you never
goes down,
decreasing the loan. Some people are thinking about the longer repayment period in the Plan 5 loan, which is now 40 years. And some people are thinking about the repayment threshold, so the point at which you actually start to repay. And I suppose that was the big change in the budget, was the freezing of that. And then there's other people in the commentary space who are talking about the decline in maintenance funding, the reintroduction somewhat of maintenance grants not really happening, and also maintenance loans. So I suppose when you're looking at this debate, how would you think about the different sides within the debate? And could you pass any judgment on who, in your view, is focusing on the right thing?
Fascinating. I mean, look, I don't blame people for looking at their student loan statement, making payments every year for 5 or 6 or 7 years, struggling to get on the housing ladder, all the wider problems that we know exist intergenerationally, who were told it was a loan, get a piece of paper, at least a PDF, that says it's from the student loan company, but they never seem to be able to make the loan go down. Now, what I used to do actually with medical graduates was say to them, look, this is a 30-year graduate tax for you. That figure in the bottom right-hand corner could be £2 million. It doesn't matter. You're just going to pay that graduate tax for 30 years. The problem is I don't think that's what they thought. No one said to them, by the way, you're definitely going to pay this for 30 years. I think when you say to people, take out a loan, they imagine they're going to be able to pay it off. And certainly prior to the 9K fees system, most people did pay it off. So lots of the kind of advisors, the teachers, the people roaming around will have kind of explained it broadly like that. So I don't blame them, even though I think they're kind of wrong, right? Similarly, there are some people that will say the Plan 5 loans, which have lower interest, are actually less progressive because what they do is they take less money off rich graduates in a couple of decades, and as a result, that means there's less money to subsidise poorer graduates. And so if you think about it as a tax, a progressive tax, I don't blame those people for saying, hold on, this was supposed to be a progressive graduate contribution system. You've made it less progressive, right? But again, because it's this hybrid system, each of the features in and of themselves can feel really, really unfair. And I think what nobody did either at the start, during, or to some extent even now, is put them all together and understand the psychological impact on particularly younger people. And I think, what we can't escape from is when you've got a housing crisis, an ageing population, a country whose economy isn't looking too sharp, the cost of borrowing going through the ceiling because suddenly Germany's borrowing, right? You add all this up, and in a way, it doesn't really matter that each of the individual features are being often, in a contradictory way, experienced as an injustice. It just feeds into this overall sense that what our politics is doing is servicing the needs of an ageing population who vote, rather than younger generations who are both staring at their bank balance and their future and thinking, this is miserable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot to agree with there. I think, from our perspective, it's always important, I think, to situate this particular issue in the broader spectrum of pressures that younger people are facing. I suppose, what do you think the government's internal thinking is this? If you could try and inhabit Rachel Reeves' mind for a moment, because a few months ago she defended the system as fair and reasonable and did the whole argument about, well, why are you having builders having to pay for bankers to go to university? That's a classic thing. And then recently she's come back and admitted that the system is, in her words, broken, I believe. And they've obviously got a Treasury committee looking into the topic now. But if you were to just indulge me for a second to think about, what do you think is going through Rachel Reeves' mind when she's engaging with this issue?
Well, I mean, this is a spectacularly difficult thing to unpack. So I end up having to go back in time to answer this question, right? But broadly, it works like this. So here we are in 2010. The coalition government comes in, and for the third time in 3 decades, the higher education sector is expanding and has run out of money. And what we did in the 90s and the noughties was transfer a bit of the cost onto graduates. So each time what we did in the 90s for £1,000 fees, noughties £3,000 fees, we shift a bit of the cost of HE onto graduates so that universities don't go bankrupt and so that you can expand the system a little bit. So you get to 2009, and it's happened again. And of course, Tories come in with the Lib Dems, and the Tories' concern is we've got to cut public expenditure, so austerity, blah, blah, blah. And Vince Cable's concern, who's the business secretary because universities were inside business, his concern was, you've got to make this progressive. So you get this really interesting coalition discussion going on. And where they get to, partly off the back of a review led by a former boss of BP, Lord Brown, is they end up with this really interesting system. So broadly, they were going from expecting £3,000 to be paid in fees, loaned to you that you'd pay mostly back, to about 4,200, 4,300, okay? But they didn't sell it like that. And they didn't sell it like that because what they clocked was, if I lend you £9,000 and I'm only expecting £4,500 back, the result of that is that I've put up fees by £1,500 in comparison to the end of that decade. But I haven't cut public expenditure on higher education. And of course, topping up the 4,500, the 3,000 was these big grants to universities for teaching. So what they worked out is, if we put all the grants that we used to give to universities into the loan, I can lend you £9,000. I can expect significantly less than £9,000 back. But what I'll do is, I'll, as a result, massively reduce my spend on grants to universities. That'll make my in-year budget look good. And what I'll show on my country's balance sheet is £9,000. So it looks like the country's getting richer. Now, you might say, other people might say, well, surely someone had to recognise at some point that they were going to lose a bit of money on those loans. But for at least the first half of the last decade, they didn't. And then suddenly the Office for National Statistics comes along and says, hold on here. We can't be in a position where you are effectively still putting quite a bit of money into subsidising higher education and making this massive amount of money on your balance sheet, this big debt pile, look much more valuable than it really is. And what ONS does is quite clever, actually. So it says, I tell you what, I'll lend you 10 quid, and if I reckon I'm only going to get 9 back, you can put £9 on your balance sheet, and you have to spend £1 that year in your sort of day-to-day current account. And that results in a bit of a hit to the Treasury that year, but that's what happens. The problem is, when you then later clock that, what you've got to do now and again is revise your guess on how much is going to come back, either because graduates aren't doing as well in the labour market, or the economy isn't doing as well, or your guess on the value of money in 30 or 40 years was out. You have to make corrections to that partitioning that you did. And the result is extraordinary, okay? So imagine you're Rachel Reeves today, to actually get to your question. Sorry it took so long. Imagine you're Rachel Reeves today. If, for example, you want to make student loan terms very, very, very slightly better for graduates, that means that the value on the balance sheet goes down a bit, and every single cohort's worth of students that you've already lent money to, you suddenly have to pay for that correction for all 10 years or all 12 years and so on. So you make a tiny change to make student loans better, and it shows up as 6, 7, 8, 9 billion pound in this year's expenditure. The problem is the reverse is true too. So if, for example, and I don't know, but if, for example, you're scrabbling round the weekend before the budget trying to find ways to make the Excel sheet add up, and you're £6 or £7 billion short, my God, does it become tempting to make student loan terms very, very slightly worse, because what that instantly does is give you this big bonanza in year of savings on the write-offs that you've done over 10 or 11 years. And so we're in this surreal position where once you've got a build-up of student debt, there are deep incentives on the Treasury to fiddle with the terms and conditions in order to free up money for this year and to never make them better because of the cost this year. And that is a really dangerous place to be for fairly obvious reasons when we're in global instability, the economy's not doing so well, and so on. There you go.
Yeah, fascinating. And I think especially you can see the temptations why they would be particularly strong given just how poor the public finances are more broadly.
Absolutely, yeah.
I suppose it'd be good to get a sense from you, because there are many features of the system that we've spoken about that seem like if you were starting from scratch, this is not how you would perhaps design a system. They've evolved over time and changed. And it seems to be the case that what you're saying with the burden shifting a little bit more onto graduates over time compared to state funding.
Yeah.
How unusual is the English system for higher education compared to some other countries around the world?
Yeah.
Both in terms of taking out the loan, kind of how you repay the loan, and I suppose that split between public and private funding for higher education. How does England compare?
Well, I guess the first thing to say is actually per student per year, when you also chuck in research costs, we are, world renowned for our research and our research capacity. We did quite a lot of research in higher education in comparison to other systems. Our cost per head per student, in other words, the money that universities get, plus the money that students get in maintenance, because more of our students than most countries leave home to go to university. It looks like quite an expensive system. So if you lined up all of the OECD, we're sort of up there with Luxembourg and the United States with their big sports stadiums. One of the features of that, though, by the way, is we also ram our undergraduates through at top speed. So we have the youngest bachelor's undergraduates in the OECD, and that, by definition, makes the per year cost look more expensive. If you're somewhere in Europe and you're taking 7 years, you're kind of spreading the cost. But then when you look at the amount of money that then the Treasury is definitely expecting back, we also spend absolute peanuts on higher education in comparison to almost every other country in the OECD, because the thing that is hidden and the thing that is hard to calculate, is contested, different think tanks have a different version, is, okay, it costs £1, how much is the graduate putting in and how much is the taxpayer putting in? There are different ways of calculating it. You partly have to guess whether graduates are going to do well. That always involves looking back rather than looking forward. You have to guess the value of money and so on. But almost no other country, certainly in Europe, has as low a subsidy as we do. And the lower the subsidy gets, the harder it is then to run a system that looks and sounds fair. So, plenty of countries have got an income contingent loan scheme. And really what that means is they're sort of allowing people to have repayment holidays. So in some countries in Europe, maybe I'll start paying back 2 years after graduation because I get a plum job in the financial services. Maybe I'm in the public services and I start paying back 7 years later, but probably everyone's going to end up paying it all back because they haven't borrowed that much money. When you start loaning people the vast majority of their higher education costs, you can't do that anymore. And so you end up with all of these different trade-offs about who pays, when they pay, how much they pay, and how much they pay in comparison to someone else at a particular point in time. As a result, the thing that it would be fantastic to be able to simplistically do, but not even the OECD does this, is just compare every government's intended split in that pound between what the graduate will put in and the taxpayer will put in, but almost nobody calculates that, and the OECD doesn't calculate it. And so the result is that we can't see how much the government is intending to spend on young people's, or not always young people, but people's higher education. And so the debate becomes impossibly obscured.
I suppose maybe not so much internationally, but one of the comparisons that you often hear in the policy debate in the UK is the difference between Scotland's higher education system and England's.
Yeah.
So I suppose it'd be great to get a sense from you of what are people talking about when they make that comparison? What are they pointing towards Scotland for as an alternative way to do it? And I suppose whether you think the Scottish model is better or does it have its own drawbacks?
I mean, the comparison between Scotland and England is a fantastic example of what people see above the surface, the sort of tip of the iceberg, and then what happens the further you go down exploring the iceberg. So obviously, I think the thing that everybody spots is undergraduate tuition in Scotland, if you're from Scotland, is free. And of course they spot it, because as the SNP finds it harder and harder to defend its record after year, it just needs some things it can count on its hand in a media appearance. And one of the totemic things is still free education, even though postgraduate education isn't free and people are taking out loans for their living costs. The problem is there's a bunch of other things that it's really important to think about. So it is at least arguable that if you're a young person, or actually not even just if you're a young person, it's in your interest to try and have as much money spent on your education as possible. Clearly there's an interface with how much you might have to pay for that. But if I was comparing having £1,000 spent on me and £10,000 spent on me, I'd quite like £10,000 spent on me, as long as that was being spent well and efficiently, and so on. And there's no doubt that Scottish universities are finding it really hard to deliver good student experiences. Lots and lots of cuts programs, big scandal around Dundee, running out of money and having to make lots of cuts to its programs, and so on. But my favourite thing about Scotland sort of runs like this. When you take out a lower loan in total, you're more likely to pay more of it back. So, of course, on graduation, the figure is significantly lower in comparison to, say, an English Plan 2 graduate, because you haven't borrowed any of the money for your tuition fees. The problem, of course, is you're going to, by the end of that 30 years in Scotland, have paid much more of the total cost back than someone in England who gets more of it written off. So the actual lifetime contribution to how much you pay for higher education in Scotland and England, if I compare, someone that went in 8 years ago in Scotland and England, is not massively different depending on your kind of earnings trajectory. But inevitably, it's really hard to predict how you're going to do in the labour market in 30 years. So what people do is they look at the sticker price. And it's a bit like buying a car. People look at the sticker price, not the sort of dodgy finance deal that the car salesman is selling you, which is the real indication of how much you'll end up paying for that car.
That's fascinating. I suppose maybe just if we change gears for a moment on thinking about the distribution of cost and who actually pays, I think you've spoken about it in the past, is that there might be a more, or perhaps alongside a more immediate cost of learning crisis. So thinking about when students are at university, how can they actually afford to live whilst they're there?
Yeah.
And so I suppose if you could talk about the decline in, or the end of maintenance grants, and then also some of the issues around maintenance loans that students are able to take out, and whether students can actually afford to provide for themselves whilst they're studying at university.
So there's various aspects to this. The first relates to something I said earlier, which is we have a student finance system whose baked in deep assumptions are that you'll get a bachelor's degree done in 3 years. And, the average across the OECD is much longer. Pretty much that's the shortest. We're joint with Belgium, okay? And the reason that's a problem is international stats on your capabilities as a graduate are really interesting because they track the number of years spent in education really closely, and all of the other factors are less important. So in other words, if you take 6 years to get your bachelor's done in Finland, you just end up as a more skilled, more talented, better educated graduate, whatever the program outcomes or whatever the design of the program. So we already have a student finance system that's obsessed with this idea that you do it in 3 years, you do it at the end of school, la la la. You can't have a setback, yeah? Then what happens is, I said earlier, on one level what you want, I think, is, as long as it's being spent efficiently, you want as much money as possible spent on the sort of university side of the bargain. So although nobody wants fees, the sticker price, to be huge, People do want their universities to be well funded, to have enough staff to teach you, so that when you email the tutor and say, I'm a bit confused with X, you actually get a response, so that you don't see on Blue Sky that your lecturer it's 3 a.m, they're on their 4th bottle of wine, and that's how they're marking your work. Some of these things are perfectly reasonable. But then the other part of that equation is, have you got enough money to live? Now, I could have 1,000 conversations with people about what it is that produces educational outcomes as a graduate, and it's partly about what you think higher education is for. But there's not a lot of debate about this idea that it's not all about what's in the timetable, and it's not all about assessment. It's partly about immersion, it's partly about networking, it's partly about just being able to be in spaces to think and to talk and so on. Lots of the freedom of speech debate assumes that students are just kind of sat around talking, debating things. It's about student clubs and societies. It's about extracurricular experiences. And that doesn't have to be a sort of old-fashioned residential halls of residence perception. It's about immersion. Higher education immersion appears to produce lots of the outcomes that people want it to produce. The problem is that if you make the student part of the student experience so efficient that the only way that they can afford to participate is by working 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 hours a week, really what they are is part-time students fulfilling full-time roles in the labour market, and they can't immerse. So do they still get the piece of paper at the end? Yep. They've submitted the essays, maybe they've used AI, maybe they haven't, I don't know. They've produced the programme outcomes, but maybe they haven't had their mind changed on the world. Maybe they haven't considered where their subject area sits in wider debates. And all those other things I think that we want from higher education. And it's a classic goose and golden egg thing that public policy is littered with. I know if we make that a little bit more efficient, it'll be fine for next year. And over time, what has happened is, for example, 10 years ago, the student finance system in terms of maintenance grants and maintenance loans, and then when George Osborne went to full maintenance loans, we were covering about 35 hours a week on the minimum wage, albeit that it was a loan. We're now down to about 18 or 19 hours a week. And so if you're in London, or you're a medic, or you're a midwife, or whatever, it isn't possible to live on the money, even when your parents have contributed. And what that does is it robs you of the ability to actually get the most out of the student experience that you thought you were getting. And so the result is that on both sides of that equation, by definition, the education is worse because the university side of the partnership has got less money to spend on you, and you've got less time and money to immerse in what's there.
So do you think there'd be a difference then of for parents now, or perhaps when they're a little bit older, sending their kids to university, the kind of difference in the university experience that someone's parents, like my age, if you're in your late 20s, come through university, the experience I might have had to my parents' generation at university, they probably presumably would have not worked at all or worked much, much less.
Look, there are trade-offs here, okay? So if someone said to me, look, 1 in 30 people go to university and have this glorious time, it's probably quite good for them to do a bit of work while they're there, to get a bit of experience in the labour market. Actually, there is good research on that says if you work kind of up to about 15 hours a week, it prepares you for the world of work, it's good for your time management, it's good for your relationships and so on. If someone said to me, on balance, so you might not be quite as full-time as your uncle, but remember your dad didn't get to go to university, so you're definitely going to get to go, and the trade-off is you'll just have to work 10 or 15 hours a week in the local cafe. I might sit down and say, okay, that's fair enough. The problem is no one's worked out where that limit should be. Yeah. So if I look at the international research, for example, on students and part-time work, what I would say is the government has a responsibility to anchor the student finance package such that either with a means-tested parental contribution or directly if your parents haven't got any money, it will cover you for what we say is full-time study, which is about 35, 36, 37 hours a week, full-time work. The fact that no one sets that limit means that you can salami slice it getting worse every year. And the problem then becomes both intergenerational and really problematic in terms of class. Because guess what? There are still plenty of people that you see in the prospectus sitting under trees with all the time in the world that are thinking, bumping into each other and playing hockey, okay? There are lots more students now that are having to make lots of difficult choices, because if they don't go in for that shift this afternoon, they might lose their precarious job. And anyway, they need the money to make rent. And then there's this other group of very precarious students who perhaps didn't realise quite how expensive all of this is, because people's advice comes from a sort of good place, a kind of reminiscing place. Get there, look at how much rent really is, look at how much all the other costs really are, look at the demands on their course and the timetable, and think, I can't even resemble the traditional student experience. And nobody warns them about that, and it's kind of in no one's interest to warn them about that. And so you end up, as I say, with this intergenerational bifurcation and this social class bifurcation. And if you're on the wrong end of both of those, it's obviously hugely problematic.
Absolutely. I think picking up on that intergenerational point, I think you touched on it previously about a common defence of the current system is that it's progressive, because for those graduates who, particularly under Plan 2, earn more, they pay more, which enables the loan write-offs for lower earning graduates. But I think one view which we have is that this is a kind of redistribution that's already happening within one generation, the younger generation, that's already under a huge amount of pressure, rather than between generations through general taxation. So I suppose, do you have any reflections on both thinking about the progressivity of the model, but also, I suppose, progressivity and fairness between different generations as well?
It's a great question. You know, one of the things I constantly say is this system is like an onion. There are lots of layers. Every time you remove one, you're more likely to cry. And you know, one of the layers that people get to that I think is really helpful, you know, there are quite a few Labour MPs right now that have got to this layer, is spotting that it's not really a loan. And as you say, when you have interest on a loan and a write-off period, that allows you to soak the rich graduates, to fund your midwives and the people who don't do so well at higher education and so on. So when you lower interest, actually the only people you really benefit are people who are going to end up very rich as graduates in 20 years' time and so on. And when people get there, that's quite an interesting debate, because you're asking yourself, this is a partially privatised public good. Should it be paid for on the basis of who gets the most financial benefit? Or should it be paid for on the basis of how much it costs? Okay, and that's an interesting debate. Part of my worry is it's not a debate that's easy to access, not a debate the government wants anyone to have. It's not a debate that gets submitted as a motion in Parliament. It's a kind of hidden debate for think tankers and nerds and some people's uncles. Yeah. The problem, though, is that even when you get to that layer in the onion, a couple of layers down, you've got this much bigger thing, which is the stuff you were talking about earlier, which is, in a way, you're dancing on the head of a pin on whether rich graduates or medium-earning graduates end up paying the bulk of it, in comparison to how much the state in the end is going to put in versus the graduate. And, if you design a system where your intended subsidy through those features in the loan, like the repayment threshold and the write-off, is 10p in the pound, and then over 10 years, without telling anyone, you switch that on its head and you say, well, no, it's going to be 90% now. That has a significantly more dramatic impact, both on the extent to which you can be progressive and on the extent to which you're trading off current versus future generations. And I think part of my point about that is, if over time, either deliberately or by stealth, the government has now moved us into a position where it is hardly subsidising higher education at all, has pretty much loaded the bulk of the cost onto graduates, in a way it doesn't really matter how the row between those graduates pans out in terms of who pays a bit more and who pays a bit less. Collectively, they've been mugged off. And our inability to have a public debate about that then means that, I'm not saying the debate about progressivity between graduates isn't important, but it's less important than that intergenerational unfairness.
Yeah, I think we would tend to agree with that. One final question before we wrap up today. So I think given all we've discussed, one, just a quick summary of how you see the landscape of intergenerational fairness more broadly. So,
grandma sucking eggs. I'm on an Intergenerational Foundation podcast. We have an ageing population. Our ageing population wants to stay in the house it's lived in all of its life, and that house has got plenty of space in it. We're not building houses as fast as we should. The ratio between taxpayers and non-taxpayers that need funding for their health and social care is getting worse every year. We are sliding into the same problem that Japan had first, that Portugal is in the middle of. Someone at some point has to stop and say, not only is this unfair from an intergenerational point of view, it's really, really stupid, because at some point you just have no money left for any public services other than your health and your social care system. And it's kind of interesting to me, I think, that even though this is really clear in countries like Japan, it doesn't stop our political systems kind of lemming-like walking into exactly the same set of problems. Trying to find a minister rather than a backbencher that will talk about the working age to pensionable age ratio is like trying to find a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And I think, by the way, on that, it is harder when you're in your political system where your populism is on the way up rather than plateauing and back on the way down.
if you were advising a government, if they called you in, someone at Department for Education or Rachel Reeves called you in and actually wanted to improve intergenerational fairness, and particularly regarding the student finance system, what are 1 to 2 changes, practical changes, that you think would be feasible within the next kind of 5 to 10 years?
What would you do about student loans? I'll do 2 things, okay? I'd want some short-term relief for graduates who genuinely are feeling the pinch. And they're feeling the pinch, obviously, because we're about to go into yet another inflation crisis. The lower your income, the higher inflation is. We kid ourselves about what inflation means because it's the same basket for everybody. That housing costs are astronomical, and even the most optimistic housing targets are not going to fix the housing market in the next 2 or 3 years. So what I would do is I would allow every graduate a 4 to 5 year repayment holiday. And the reason I'd do it is I think it was the right thing to do during COVID on people's mortgages. It was actually very welcome from lots and lots of people. It actually specifically assists with some of the injustices that relate to maternity and pregnancy. And also broadly, because of where the government thinks Plan 5 is going to get to in terms of the total amount that will come back in, wouldn't have a huge impact, at least in the long term, on the value of the student loan book. I just think it would be the right thing to do for the people who worry because they're struggling graduates, that they're choosing between heating and eating. Second thing that I would do is I would look back at a proposal that was made jointly between the Russell Group and Martin Lewis, the money saving expert, a few years ago now, which was to completely change the way that the student loan statement is framed. And instead of the way it's currently framed, I would predict for people how much they're likely to repay and how long they're likely to repay for, all being equal. And the reason I do that is because I'm reaching that point in my life, right, where, oh my God, I'm thinking about pension. And with some financial conduct authority regulation around it, what my pension calculator does on the web is guess at how much my pension pot is going to be worth by the time I sort of get there. If that's possible, it must be possible to do it for, this curious, complicated set of calculations. And I think that would just be more honest with everybody about the way the kind of system works. But the third thing that I would do is I would kick off a review of not the student loan system, but the higher education system more broadly. And I would start by assuming that you can't run the whole thing as a market whilst you're controlling the prices and you're desperate to make sure that some people study other things in other places. And that takes you then, interestingly, down all sorts of routes, which is, how much should people put in? How much should the taxpayer put in? And to the extent to which graduates should put it in, when should they put it in? And should it be the same each, or richer ones putting more in than poorer ones? In other words, I just want a system which is capable of staging a public debate about all of these trade-offs. This room, our chat, shouldn't be necessary on an issue this important and on an issue with this amount of public funding being made. The public on one level or another should be able to participate in these public conversations. And my big dream, I guess, is that at some point the confluence of factors gets beyond it just being in the press every day and gets to a point where the public can participate in this conversation.
Brilliant. I wholeheartedly agree. Jim, it has been so fantastic to speak with you today. I think covered a lot of different topics in there, but it's been really worthwhile. I think one of the key things that take away is that I think to not hone in just on the interest rate, just on the repayment threshold, I think it's always coming back to this broader underlying question of how is the cost of university distributed between the state and the student, and what's fair. And what's fair is an open question and an open debate, but when you're still running the rhetoric of a mixed funding model with a relatively equal split between state and student, and then that's disappeared, the terms of the debate are just fundamentally incorrect. So thank you so much for joining us. If you've enjoyed today's episode, you can find more on our podcast feed. And you can also find our new research paper on student finance, which covers a lot of these topics, particularly thinking about the burden between the state and the student, on our website, which is if.org.uk, and on Instagram at Intergenerational Foundation.